All right, so before we move on to some more terminology, I just want to take a moment to talk about what we will cover in this video. So first we will ask the question, why even study Western art music? Why study the classics? What can we get out of it? Then we will move on to talking about musical features and musical function and distinguishing between the two. We will discuss properties of sound and the vocabulary that we need to be able to discuss properties of sound in a meaningful way, and also look at the instruments of the orchestra so that when you go to your concert, to do your concert report, you will recognize the instruments that you see and also the orchestra setup. All right, so why study Western art music? What can you achieve? Why do so many university programs, music programs, have an Introduction to Western Art Music course or a music appreciation course required for their students, especially for their music majors? And especially in today's day and age where people, especially young people, aren't going out to classical music concerts all that much. They don't go to the symphony orchestra that much, or to the opera perhaps, as much as they might go to a rock concert or to a live music club. So what's the big deal? Why is it important that you study Western art music? And what can it do for you in your everyday life? Well, the other day I was walking across campus here at UIS, and there were some booths set up, and students were advertising various clubs to join. And one booth had some very loud techno music playing. It sounded something like this. Right? And at first it was great. It really got my energy going. And then I started to think about the song. And I thought, let's see if I can describe what is happening here in the music, just like I would describe what is happening when I listen to a symphony. And I started to think about melody, rhythm, harmony, dynamics. And I realized all the same elements, all the same musical elements were present. Only in the symphony orchestra, the pieces are often much more complex, and all of these elements intertwine in complicated and ever-changing ways. All right, I hope you got your techno fill for the day. So, Western art music is so rich and complex that if you learn about its basic elements like rhythm, melody, form, function, you can use these tools to understand many different kinds of music, and you will probably have a much easier time analyzing other types of music once you've been through the exercise of analyzing Western art music, which is often more complicated. And you can think of Western art music kind of like Western literature. They are surprisingly similar. In Western art music, there are incredibly large and complex pieces of music that can take years of study, right? Just like a great book can take years of study to really understand and master. And pieces of music tell a story, just like books tell a story. But with music, this often happens without words, so it leaves the listener to figure out what is the story that the composer is trying to tell. Okay, so before we continue with our discussion of musical vocabulary, we need to examine musical features and musical functions. What is the difference? Well, musical features and musical functions are two basic ways in which we can talk about music. We can describe music. All right, so if we are talking about musical features, we are describing the actual sound that we hear. So we're describing the actual music that we hear. Musical features include rhythm. How does the rhythm flow? Meter. How are the beats organized in the piece of music? Dynamics. How loud or soft the music is. Tempo. how fast, what is the speed of the music. Right, so musical features describe the actual sound of the music. Contrary to this, musical functions. Musical functions describe the role that music plays in society, in culture. Right? So music might relax us, it might just serve as mere entertainment, it might serve a therapeutic function. All right, so musical features versus musical function. And this lesson is devoted to musical features. All right. So when we're talking about music, and we're talking about musical features, we are absolutely talking about sound. We are describing sound. Right? Now, what is a sound? Well, sounds are simply vibrations that are transmitted through the air and picked up by our ears. All right, so sound is vibrations that are transmitted through the air and picked up by our ears. Now, these vibrations, they occur when an object is struck, when it's hit, plucked, it's agitated in some way. Right? You can make sounds in many ways, by talking, by singing, by tapping on a table, by slamming a door. All of these produce sound. Now, certain objects produce a musical sound, right, more effectively than others. So slamming a door might not produce a musical sound, it'll just produce a loud noise. But strings, like the strings in a violin that are strung very, very tightly and held very taut, they make a nice clear sound, a very clear note, right? Or a membrane that's stretched like the top of a drum makes a clear sound. So certain objects make a musical sound, a clear, particular, unique note that we can identify much better than other objects. And what is necessary for us to be able to hear this sound is that there has to be, in some way, some sort of amplification, some structure that helps the sound resonate, that helps the sound reach our ears loudly. And you'll notice that if you take a violin string and you stretch it between your two hands and somebody bows that string, it'll make a really, really soft sound. And why is that? It's because there is no amplifier or resonating box, right? Those elements are missing. There is no violin attached to the strings that vibrates. So when you play a string, the whole instrument vibrates and the sound reaches your ear in that way. So amplification is very, very important. Take some time to search on YouTube and just watch a symphony orchestra in action, and you will start to see the many different ways in which instruments produce sound, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the video. Okay, so there are many, many instruments in Western classical music, and especially when they appear in an orchestra, they appear in certain organization. You don't want to just have the instruments all mixed up on the stage. That would get very, very confusing. So they have devised a system of organizing the instruments of the orchestra, and you can see the four basic sections here. All right, so we have the string section, the string instruments, and those instruments sit in the front of the orchestra. So the closest to the edge of the stage, the closest to the audience. Behind the strings are the woodwind instruments, and we'll talk about what these are in a moment. So behind the strings are the woodwinds. Behind the woodwinds are the brass instruments. And behind the brass, off to the side, are the percussion instruments. All right, so the four categories: strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Now, you are responsible for those instrument categories, and I do also want you to know the instruments within those categories. All right, so in the string section, you might find a violin, a viola, and a cello section. All right, so the strings consist of 3 basic sections: violin, violas, celli or cellos, right? And the double basses, right? Violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. And I'm telling you these instruments in order of their size and also in order of the pitch that they produce. So, violins produce the highest pitch. And you see a picture of a violin here on the right side of the slide. So violins produce the highest notes, and they're the smallest stringed instruments. Violas produce slightly lower notes, and they're slightly larger. Cellos produce even lower notes, and they're even larger. Those are played upside down, right? Double basses are the largest instruments in the string section. They produce very, very low notes, and they're so big that the bass player usually has to stand up to play or to sit on a very tall stool. Right? Also included in the string section is the harp. In a large symphony orchestra, you might find 1 or sometimes even 2 harp players. All right, so you also have in your textbook, you have a whole page devoted, or a few pages devoted to the symphony orchestra, and you can see discussions of these instruments and also photos of the various instruments. So make sure you take some time to look at the musical instruments section in Unit 1. That is pages 15 through 24. And the most important page is 21, which shows you the instruments of the orchestra. All right, so that's the string section. Now, the string instruments, except for the harp, can make sound in 2 different ways. Now, you'll see a violinist, when the violinist plays, for example, they're holding a bow and they're pulling the bow across the string. So when a violinist or a cellist or a violist or a bassist is playing with a bow, that technique is known as arco. Right? That's an Italian word, arco, which means playing with a bow. You'll notice, if you go to a symphony orchestra concert, that the musicians don't always use the bow. Sometimes they play pizzicato. Pizzicato. And that means by plucking the string. They put the bow down and they pluck the string, just like a guitarist might pluck the string. So you will find all the string instruments might pluck the strings. And what's the one string instrument that always has to pluck and never uses the bow? Of course, that's the harp. Right? And you have a photo of the harp in your textbook on page 16 on the bottom right. All right, so string instruments, and they play arco or pizzicato. The next section is the woodwind instruments, and the woodwind section. The woodwinds are called as such because all of the instruments in this section, once upon a time, were made out of wood. All right, and these instruments are make sound by blowing air through the instrument, through the tube. Right, so you have a flute, which is pictured at the top right of the screen. You have an oboe pictured at the bottom right of the screen. Also, clarinets and bassoons. Again, check your textbook, page 21, for the diagrams and drawings of these instruments. These are the woodwinds. Behind the woodwinds, you have brass instruments, and I'm sure you've already guessed, brass instruments are made out of brass. And there are 4 instruments in this section: the French horn, which you see on the top right of the screen, the trumpet on the bottom right of the screen, the trombones, and the tuba. Those, again, are pictured in your textbook. Finally, the last section is the percussion section. This section is devoted to keeping rhythm. And there are many, many different instruments in the percussion section. There are endless instruments. The most popular instrument, the most common instrument, is the timpani. And those are the 2 drums you see pictured on the top right of your screen. You can also find instruments like cymbals, bells, snare drum, triangle, xylophone, marimba, and so on and so on. They're endless, the percussion instruments. But basically, percussionists are trained to play any kind of instrument that can keep a rhythm. All right, and you have timpani pictured on page 20 of your textbook. Okay, so we had those four instrument categories: strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. There are musicologists who were working in Germany in the early 20th century who decided that we needed another way to organize instruments because they were discovering instruments from around the world that didn't really fit into these sections of the orchestra. And so they produced another way of categorizing instruments, and these categories are based on the way in which the instruments produce sound. So, the four categories are chordophone, aerophone, membranophone, and idiophone. Chordophone, aerophone, membranophone, and idiophone. Now, a chordophone, you'll see it has the word chord in it from the Greek root for string, chordi. Chordophones make sound when a string is vibrated. So it's either plucked or bowed. So as you can imagine, examples of chordophones include violin, viola, bass, harp, cello. Those are instruments that make sound when their strings are agitated. Aerophones are wind instruments, and that's easy to remember because it has the word air in it, misspelled, but you understand that it's the root, right, of aerophone, wind instrument. And those are instruments that produce sound when air is blown through the instrument. And so what might an aerophone be? Well, how about a flute, or a clarinet, or an oboe, right? Anything that produces sound when air is blown through it. The third instrument category, membranophone, and you'll see it almost has the word membrane. This instrument category refers to instruments that make sound when a membrane is stretched across the instrument and it is hit or struck or agitated in some way. So, of course, an example of an instrument that has a stretched membrane that is hit is a drum. The last category is usually the most complex category to identify. This is the idiophone category. And that simply refers to instruments that make sound when two parts of the instrument are clanged together. So the idiophone is struck or agitated just like a drum, but it doesn't have a stretched membrane. It doesn't have a stretched surface over the top. So you might think of maracas that are filled with beads, right? As you shake maracas, they make a sound. That's an idiophone. Or you can think even of clapping hands. When you clap your hands together, right? There's no stretched membrane. It's just two parts of your hands hitting together and making sound. All right, so these instrument categories you're also responsible for. So chordophone, aerophone, membranophone, and idiophone. And now whenever you come across any kind of instrument from any part of the world, you can decide in which category it fits. Okay, and last but not least, you saw this in the first slide and I didn't mention it, I'll mention it now. Every symphony orchestra, or almost every symphony orchestra, is led by a conductor. And if you go to an orchestra concert, you will see that there is somebody standing in the center of the orchestra in the front, waving his or her arms around and directing the orchestra. And if you're not familiar with the way in which a conductor works with the orchestra, the conductor can kind of seem extra or superfluous, but the conductor is actually very, very important. The conductor does many things. For example, the conductor sets the tempo of the piece, so how fast or how slow the musician should play. The conductor indicates how loudly or how softly the musician should play. The conductor indicates emotion, right? With what kind of feeling should the musicians play? And perhaps the main role of the conductor is to keep the musicians together. By the way in which he or she moves their arms, the musicians know how to play together in time. So when you have an orchestra that has 150 or 200 musicians, it's very, very helpful to have a conductor there keeping the time for you. And many times you'll see that conductors hold a baton, a little stick, a white stick, that helps musicians focus on that one little stick that he beats in the air and keeps the time very, very clearly. All right, so that's the conductor. Okay, so moving on to more vocabulary. We talked last time about rhythm, and now we're going to move on and talk about actual notes, pitch. So not talking about how music moves in time, but talking about the actual notes. Now, when a composer sits down to write a piece of music and has a blank piece of paper, right, in front of her, she has to make a lot of decisions. Which instrument is she going to write for? How loud or how soft will the piece be? So that's dynamics. Which notes will she put on paper? Right? Which pitches will she use? And so on. So there's a lot of elements that have to go into writing a piece of music. So let's look at some of these most basic elements that the composer has to decide. So we begin with pitch. Now, have you ever heard a musician say, "What note is that?" or "What pitch is that?" This simply refers to how high or how low a note may be, right? So the answer might be, "Oh, that is pitch C," or "That is a pitch D," right? So how high or how low. This is not how loud or soft, but how high the pitch is, how high up or how low it sounds, right? So a bass would produce very, very low pitch, and a piccolo would produce a very, very high pitch, right? So high or low. We're talking about pitch, high or low, not dynamics, all right? And what we're actually talking about when we talk about pitch is we're talking about sound waves. Now, we talked about sound before, and I said you can produce sounds that are musical or non-musical sounds. A sound that occurs when an object is struck or agitated is actually a wave. You can't see this wave, right? It's invisible. It's very, very, very fast. But the sound wave, let's say when you tap the desk, the sound wave travels from the desk to your ear, and that's how your ear picks up on sound, right? It hears the wave. The wave agitates your eardrum. So if you have a very, very high note, the sound wave will travel very, very at a very high frequency, which means if you see here on the diagram on your screen, you have the first sound wave. It undulates, it goes up and down very, very frequently, right, compared to the second one. That's a high frequency wave. That's a high pitch. So the higher the pitch, the faster the frequency, the faster the wave of the sound wave. All right, and a low pitch has a much, much slower frequency. So a good note to make or to remember is that pitch is the same thing. It's synonymous with frequency, right? So if somebody tells you that this note is a D, they're telling you about the frequency. They're telling you about how quickly that sound wave is undulating back and forth. All right, so that's pitch. How high or how low a note is, and pitch is synonymous with frequency. Okay, this is our last diagram with sound waves. We can also talk about dynamics when we're talking about a sound. Dynamics simply means how loud or how soft a note is, right? Like the volume on your radio. When you turn the volume all the way up, that's a very high volume, loud dynamics. When you turn it all the way down, that's a low volume or soft dynamics. And again, that completely is dependent upon the sound wave. So now we're not talking about the frequency. We're not talking about how often the wave goes up and down, but we're talking about how tall the wave is. So if the sound wave is not very tall at all, like the first sound wave on this screen on the top, that means it's a very soft dynamic. But if the sound wave is very, very tall, that means it's a loud dynamic or a loud volume. Alright, so we had pitch, which equals frequency, and talks about how high or how low a note is, and now we have dynamics, which talks about how high, how tall or short a sound wave is. The fancy word for dynamics, or how tall or short a sound wave is amplitude. And you see that word on the top right of your screen. So when we're talking about dynamics, we're talking about amplitude. How tall or short is a sound wave? Okay, so in order for a composer to relay to the musician reading the score how loud or soft they should play, they've developed a series of Italian terms for this. And these are very, very important terms. So the basic dynamics terms are in the center of your screen here in red. All right. If a composer wants the musician to play loudly, they will not write loud in the score, but they will write forte. All right, forte. If the composer wants the musician to play softly, they won't write soft, they will write piano. All right, so we have forte and we have piano. Let's say the composer wants the musicians to play very, very loud. They will write fortissimo. Fortissimo. If the composer wants the musician to play very, very softly, they will write pianissimo. All right, so we have forte, loud, fortissimo, very loud. Piano is soft, pianissimo is very soft. Now, if the composer wants something in between forte and fortissimo, the composer will write mezzo forte, not too loud. If the composer wants something between soft piano and pianissimo, they'll write mezzo piano, not too soft. All right, so we have mezzo forte, forte, and fortissimo, mezzo piano, piano, and pianissimo. A few more terms on this screen, Italian terms. A composer might not want the dynamics to change suddenly from piano, very soft, to forte, very loud. They might write in the score to get louder slowly or to get softer slowly. And there are Italian terms for this: to get louder, crescendo, and to get softer, decrescendo. All right, crescendo gets louder, decrescendo to get softer. If the composer wants the change to be sudden, he'll write subito, sudden, subito. All right, so you have 9 Italian terms there. The most important terms for you to know are forte, piano, fortissimo, pianissimo, and crescendo and decrescendo. Those are the most important terms there. Okay, so moving on from dynamics, now let's talk about a much simpler term, and that is tone color, also known as timbre. Now, when we're talking about tone color, to put it simply, tone color simply lets us know what instrument we're listening to, right? So how do you describe the sound? Because I could play a note on the trumpet, let's say if I play the note G on the trumpet, and I could play that same note G on the violin and the same note G on the oboe. Well, how do I know that those are different instruments? They're all playing the exact same note. Well, their sound quality is different. All right, so that sound quality is known as tone color or timbre. And we haven't come up with very, very useful terms, or accurate terms, I should say, to describe tone color and timbre. So we just used adjectives. So I might ask you, describe the timbre of the trumpet. And you might say, it sounds bright. It sounds brassy, right? Or I might say, describe the tone color of the viola. And you might say, it sounds warm, right? So simply using adjectives to talk about tone color or timbre. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about how to describe the pitches that you hear, dynamics and tone color and sound waves and pitch. Let's talk about now organizing pitches, because a composer can't just put down pitches in any random order. Well, he could, but most composers don't tend to do that. You have to organize the pitches in some way so that they make sense, right? Which pitches will he use in the piece, and which ones will he leave out, right? Will he use all the possible pitches or just some of them? Okay. So, making a decision about pitch. The most important decision that a composer makes is determining home base, right? So when you're going to write a piece of music, you've got to choose which pitch is going to start the piece, which pitch will end the piece, and which one will serve as the central home base throughout the whole piece. And that one pitch, it's very, very special. It has its own special name. It's called the tonic, all right? The tonic. So the tonic is the note around which an entire piece of music is based. So if you start a piece of music based around, let's say it's based around pitch C, and then you end on pitch F, that sounds very funny, right? The audience will think, whoa, the piece probably isn't finished yet. It only feels really satisfyingly ended, the piece, when it returns to the tonic, when it returns to that pitch C that you started. All right, so the tonic is that home pitch around which an entire piece is organized, and a pitch that is emphasized again and again throughout a piece. Now, once a composer chooses the tonic, the home base, right, he also has to choose other notes to use, right? And you can see here, even if you don't read music, that there are these black circles spread out on the staff, on the lines and the spaces. And these black circles form a scale, right? A group of notes that a composer can use to write a piece. And you can see that this one is centered on C, right? The first note is C, so the tonic for this composition would be C. All right, so you have a scale based on the note C, which in this piece would serve as the tonic. Okay? And your textbook provides a useful definition of a scale, a selection of ordered pitches that provides material for the music. All right, so a scale is a group of pitches in a particular order that a composer uses to write a piece of music. Now, you don't have to understand the music theory behind this, but there are two types of scales that are very, very common for composers to use as the base of their composition. The first one is the diatonic scale. The diatonic scale is the scale that uses only the white keys on the piano. You see here you have a diagram of a scale of a keyboard that has white and black keys, and I've put blue stars on the white keys. So you have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That is a diatonic scale. It doesn't use any of the black keys. And that would sound like C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Right? That is a diatonic scale. That's the most common scale in Western art music. There's another kind of scale that doesn't skip the black notes, but uses all the white notes and all the black notes. And that is known as a chromatic scale, right? For chroma, color. It's a scale that has a lot of color. It's colorful in sound. All right, so this scale doesn't use 8 pitches, right, like the previous scale. It uses 12, right? All the white and black notes. And that would sound something like C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C. Right, so many, many more notes, and you can write pieces that are much more colorful and interesting that way. So diatonic scale and chromatic scale. Okay, so when you've got the notes in your scale, you choose I'm going to use a chromatic scale or I'm going to use a diatonic scale. Then you have to write a melody of some kind. Now, what is a melody? A melody is a tune, right? It is the part of the music that you remember and you sing when you go home after hearing it, right? So a melody is a memorable series of notes or a memorable tune, right? And you can see here on the screen that the melody is in the top line of notes. You have two lines of notes. One, the bottom line, has much fewer notes, right, stacked on each other, these open circles. But above that line, the top line, there is the moving melody. And this is the melody for Mary Had a Little Lamb. You can see, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Right? That is the melody. That's the part of the music that you would remember and go home and sing. The other notes on that staff underneath the melody support it. They're not the melody. They're just accompaniment. Right? If I were to sing to you the bottom line, I would sing G, 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 and so on. So not very interesting at all. So the melody is the interesting, memorable line of music that you would go home and sing. Okay, and just to end, oops, didn't mean to close that quite yet. Just to end, our last two terms for the day. I know this was a very, very full lesson, but all of these terms that you learned, you will use again and again throughout the whole semester. So these are the basic terms that you need to describe all the music that you're going to hear until the end of the course. So these are really, really important. Make sure you've got these, you commit these to memory so that you can talk about the music that we're going to listen to with ease. Because a lot of what we're going to do here on in is learn how to apply all of this musical vocabulary to the music that you're going to hear. Okay, so the very, very last terms are theme and motive. All right. Now, what is a theme? Well, think about when you are reading a book, right? And there is a main idea that sort of you can trace throughout the book. That is a main theme. It's the same thing in a piece of music, right? So a theme, let's think of a famous theme. Well, we have the famous theme here on the screen from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? Ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, and so on, right? That is the famous theme. That's the famous group of notes that runs throughout a piece of music over and over and over again. So you can talk about a theme that keeps repeating. Da-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum. That's the theme for the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And interestingly, you can break this down even to something even smaller. And that little building block that makes up that theme, the little building blocks that make up the theme, are known as motives. All right, so if we were to choose out the motive here, it would be ba-ba-ba-bum, right? Because if we take many of those ba-ba-ba-ba little motives and we put them together, they make up the theme, right? Here's the first time, ba-ba-ba-bum. Here's the second time, ba-ba-ba-bum. Here's the third time, ba-ba-ba-ba. Fourth time, ba-ba-ba-bum. Fifth time, ba-ba-ba-bum. Sixth time, and it goes on and on and on. All right, so a motive is a little tiny building block that if you put many of them together, they make up a broad theme. All right, and we'll talk a lot about different themes and motives that we hear throughout the semester. Okay, so just to reiterate, these are the very, very important musical terms that you need to use throughout the entire semester when you're talking about any of the music that we will listen to starting next week. So please send me an email, go through these. If there's something you would like me to reiterate or explain more thoroughly, I am happy to do so. Also be sure that you do your reading in the textbook. The reading reiterates much of what I said today very, very clearly and provides you very, very clear explanations and also definitions of the main terms.